Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. Today's episode is an episode that every person needs to listen to, especially if you struggle with people-pleasing, kind of that fawning response. If you fall into the category of codependency, meaning you feel like in order to feel okay about yourself, your partner, your kids, all have to feel okay. And we break down so much. We look at dysfunctional families, the roles in dysfunctional families. And I hate the word dysfunctional family, but you get the idea where nobody's perfect. So I don't want to paint this picture of a perfect family where we develop ways, defenses, if you will, protective parts in order to gain belonging, love, connection, worthiness in the family system. We talk about codependency. What is it exactly? And then how to set boundaries. It was such a good conversation, and I'm so excited to introduce you to my guest. If this resonates with you, share it on social because I think this could be helpful to so many people. You're probably going to want to listen to this a couple of times because there was such good information and so many pieces that will be important to integrate into your life. So let me introduce you to today's guest. Sharon Martin, DSW, LCSW, is a psychotherapist and author specializing in codependency recovery. For the past 25 years, she's been helping adult children recover from difficult childhoods, overcome feelings of unworthiness, and learn to set boundaries. Dr. Martin is the author of 2 books, the CBT Workbook for Perfectionism and the Better Boundaries Workbook. She also writes the popular blog, Conquering Codependency for Psychology Today, and has been featured in various media outlets, including Psych Central, WebMD, Women's World, and Highly Sensitive Refuge. Those sound very powerful. And I think this is an episode that we're really breaking down the root of codependency. We're looking at how did we develop it? How do we work through it? And it really starts with becoming more self-aware of your patterns, your behavior, and then a willingness to dive into childhood, not to blame, but to create insight. And I definitely think you want to grab the workbook at Kristen, Kristen, Boice, Kristen D, I forgot the D, Boyce, Boice.com/free resources. So you can get the free journal. That would be helpful to take notes, I think, with this episode. And let me know what you think. Did it resonate with you? What were your takeaways? You can share it on social or just send an email. Go to the website. You can send an email or tag me on social at Kristen D. Boyce. So let's dive in to all things codependency, boundaries, dysfunctional families, and let's take a deeper dive. Thanks for listening, and I can't wait to see what aha moments you have. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. My guest today, I have followed her work for a long, long time. She speaks kind of my love language, which is talking about family systems. I love talking about families, our family of origin, and diving into boundaries, codependency. And she has been on several friends' podcasts that I adore. And so I just am so excited and have the honor and privilege to introduce you to Sharon Martin today. Welcome, Sharon, to the podcast.
Thank you, Kristen. I am so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. And thank you to all of you who are listening out there. Got podcast world as well. It's great to have this chance to talk about these issues that I think are super important. And I know that, we have a lot in common in terms of our professional interests and the focus of our work. So I think it's going to be a fabulous opportunity to really delve into some of those things today.
Yes. So thank you so much. I thought we'd just get started with how did you get into the field of working as a counselor, as a psychotherapist? Tell us your journey. I always think that's so interesting.
Sure. I always never know how far back should I go on this.
As far back as you'd like.
Oh, yeah. Well, you may be sorry you asked, actually, but no. I mean, really, the most straightforward answer to it, and then I'll expand on this, is my mom was a social worker and a psychotherapist. So that's really how I got into it, is because that's what she did. And both of my parents are actually still really super committed to doing good work in the world. They're really fantastic in terms of trying to improve their community and the larger world, and whether it's environmental things or poverty or all kinds of stuff, that they're really involved in a lot of great things that they do. So I think those were just values that were instilled in me and my sisters growing up, that was something that we were taught was important. So I ended up going to school and becoming a social worker. And I spent many years working with community nonprofit organizations, a lot of work working with the homeless. And in particular, I worked for many years working with homeless youth. And this may seem unrelated to what I'm doing now, but it's actually, when I really thought back and saw what the thread was that connected this, it actually all really made a lot of sense to me. I was working with, like I said, for quite a number of years, I worked with young adults and older adolescents they were living on the streets or in really bad situations where they had essentially either left home because home was so bad, or they had been thrown out, that their parents had rejected them and they were told to leave. So a lot of family problems, chaos, very dysfunctional family systems that were going on that led these young people to be in the situation that they were in. And so now here I am, many years later, and I've been in private practice for a good 10 or 15 years at this point. And in my private practice work, I really started working with, especially with adult children of alcoholics, is really where I started my work. And then from there, it has sort of expanded. And I think this is representative of what we see in a lot of understanding about families and these types of issues, is that it's not just families where there are substance use problems, but there's dysfunction of all varieties, if you will, that goes on that leads to similar challenges for folks that are growing up in those families. So anyway, it's sort of expanded from there to working with adult children who have had all kinds of different challenging family experiences. So now we talk about this more in terms of developmental trauma. We hear this, or childhood trauma. This is the way we frame this. Honestly, when I started out in this field 25 years ago, we didn't really talk about the issues in that language. And so I think it's nice to be able to have a term for it at this point and say, that really was traumatizing. And those experiences were formative for so many people. And this is what I hear from so many of the folks that I work with, either individually as therapy clients or people that have read my books or articles and give me feedback on this, is just how impactful these experiences have been for them in terms of who they are as adults, the struggles that they have in their adult lives and in their relationships. And I think often a feeling of, why am I not over this? Why has it had such a huge impact on me? I mean, it's both the I wish it hadn't, but also I think a feeling of like, I've done something wrong again because it's still causing me problems. And there's a sense that I think once you leave home or once you grow up, that these things should sort of resolve themselves, right? It's sort of magical thinking. We wish I leave home and suddenly I would be free of those influences or those experiences, which you and I, Kristen, know. And of course, everybody listening knows as well, because you've probably experienced these things if you're listening to this podcast, is that it doesn't just go away. And we really have a lot of work often as adults to try to sort of unlearn a lot of the things that we learned growing up and process and deal with those experiences that we have had. So anyway, again, it's a very long answer to your original question, but that has sort of become the focus of my work and working with adult children around sort of the consequences of those childhood experiences. So that's things about codependency and healthy or unhealthy relationships, perfectionism, people pleasing, boundary setting, all those things, and general mental health, I would say as well, self-esteem, trying to feel good about ourselves and overcoming a lot of those issues.
So we're going to dive into all those things because that's so relevant to so many of us on many levels. We have something in common. My mom was a therapist too. Here we go. See, there's a tie here.
The tie there. Yeah.
So let's start with some foundational pieces for folks, because some people listening will think, well, I didn't really have a dysfunctional family. My family it was good. It was fine. It was good. How do you define dysfunctional family? Like, what would be your definition?
Kristen, you're giving me a hard question right off the bat. It's hard because I think it ends up making us think that there's this dichotomy. There's functional and there's dysfunctional. And I think really more accurately is for us to think about is to what extent, to what degree was your family dysfunctional? Because nobody's family is perfect. And I think we tend to think, oh, a functional family is one that's got it all figured out. They always, say the right things, do the right things. They are emotionally intelligent. They know how to show up for their kids and give them what they need at all the time. And that never happens. Nobody has parents that always do the right thing and can meet all of their needs. So anyway, when we're talking about dysfunctional families, I think in this context anyway, we're really talking about experiences where the family felt unsafe, either physically unsafe or more likely or more commonly, it's that you felt emotionally unsafe. And that can either be that you felt like you were not having your emotional needs met, right? This is what we call childhood emotional neglect is often the term that we use for that, right? That your parents weren't tuned into what you needed as a child. And so they didn't give you, whether that was attention or validation, loving words. They didn't notice when you were struggling with a problem or with a difficult emotion, and they didn't help you through those experiences. Or it can also be that you had parents that were verbally abusive towards you, that they said things that were hurtful to you, that they emotionally unsafe. It could be like a manipulative person. It could be a parent who is what we call enmeshed, which is, it's hard to explain because it's sort of a too close of a relationship, which sounds like, what's the problem with that? That sounds like a good thing to have parents who want to be close to you. But there's really a lack of boundaries in an enmeshed relationship. It's difficult for the child to develop a sense of self. And that means they don't feel like they're an independent, separate person. Instead, you feel like you're an extension of your parents. You have to do what they want you to do. You have to believe what they want you to believe. And if you don't, they often can be very angry with you. Or you could have parents who are very distant. Oh, they could be sort of a narcissistic parent or a parent who's more self-absorbed, or they could be somebody who is really, it could even be a parent who's working very hard, has 3 jobs, is out of the house, is not present for you. And again, that can be that emotional neglect. It could be physical neglect. That's a piece of that. So there's a whole number of situations, but I would say probably the common theme is that sense of, I don't feel like my needs are getting met, and or it feels like it's an unsafe environment for me. I don't feel like I have that structure, that containment, that somebody who's going to be there to protect me and look out for me, which I think is really central to what kids need, whether they may not consciously be aware of that, maybe when you're a bit older, but children are vulnerable and they need parents to help them navigate the world and navigate their inner worlds as well. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add. Like I said, I think it's
a beautiful job. Yeah, because I think the whole key with the enmeshment is you can't individuate and separate and be your own person. It's a threat to the family system. It's a threat to the parents. And so you end up to belong and to get your needs met. You kind of people please. You almost don't even know you're doing it. It's one of those almost because it's a role you kind of took on. Let's talk about roles in families. And what types of roles are there in families and how do they show up in dysfunctional families?
Well, when we think about a family system, what we're talking about is that everybody has a part to play in this dynamic. And the whole system works to try to maintain the system. That all may sound very vague and complicated, but I think if you actually think about your own family and the patterns that you would see, sort of the repeat behaviors that you would see yourself, your siblings, your parents play, you do start to see who's playing what part, and that everybody is trying to, again, not consciously, but you just see this repetition of whether it's the same arguments. It could be a situation where mom and dad have a big argument, dad leaves, or dad drinks too much and the police get called, and then, your sister's crying and you're trying to console your mother. Again, it can look a lot of different ways for a lot of different families, but again, there's often a sense of, okay, the specifics might be a little bit different, but this is a similar situation that we keep finding ourselves in, and we keep repeating the same parts that we're playing. So oftentimes clients will recognize that, okay, I have been playing this part since I was a kid, and I find myself doing the same thing here in my adult relationships. And sometimes that's where you really recognize that this is not working well for me. It may have been something that you were doing as a kid, and I'm not going to say that it was working per se as a child, but it made a lot of sense. Everything that you were doing was something that you were doing to try to cope with that really difficult, often scary experience that you were having. And as kids, we don't have resources of our own. We don't have a lot of coping skills. We don't have much life experience. So we're really limited in what our options are. So we do the best that we can, right? And so things like distracting ourselves or people pleasing or overeating or restricting our eating, these are all just examples of things that we did because they were the best coping skills we had at the moment. And again, we kept doing those because that was our role. That was our way of handling the situation. And like I said, oftentimes the older we get, the more self-awareness I think we tend to have, hopefully.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Right. And we start to say, okay, this was the best I could do as a kid, but now I would like to learn how to do something that's a healthier option, something that's going to work better for me, that's not going to have unintended consequences that are not working.
Yes, I agree. I love talking about the birthplace of codependency as we're segueing, like, here's a dysfunctional family, what we're calling dysfunctional family. Everybody's got dysfunction in it. I don't even like the label dysfunction, and it helps serve the purpose of explanation of how we kind of got to where we are.
Yeah.
So we have roles that we take on, and then how do we develop codependency? Let's start with defining what codependency is, and then how to get to be what we call, quote unquote, a codependent.
Yeah. And I'll maybe preface this with the same thing here, is that I don't think the term codependent is a particularly great descriptor or a great label that most of us feel like, oh, this is really feeling good for me to understand this about myself. I mean, where labels do sometimes feel like, okay, now I can sort of define what this is. But anyway, it's a term that I use as well, really just because it's what most people understand. It's a term that's commonly used. I wish we had a better one, but nobody has come up with something better that has stuck. People have tried, but nothing else has stuck. So for the time being, we're going to just use codependent, even though it's not really a particularly accurate term anymore, the way we use it. What we're really talking about is focusing on other people's needs rather to the extent that we are really sacrificing ourselves in a variety of ways. Our own needs, our own interest goals, things that matter to us, could be our values. We're really focused on other people, taking care of them. What do they need? How can I make sure that they're okay? Sometimes this is the rescuing. It's trying to problem solve and make sure that other people aren't getting into trouble or having horrible consequences for their actions. That's sort of the classic picture of a codependent, I think, that most of us have. And again, I mean, these are all related to those childhood experiences. Again, if you can think back about what that was like for you, and if you resonate with the idea or, having some codependent traits, and really think about what were the situations where in your best interest to take care of other people, or how did it benefit you if you were hyper aware of what everybody else in the family was doing so that you could protect yourself, you could do whatever it was that you had. Again, your limited options here to try to keep yourself safe and avoid situations that were uncomfortable or abusive or scary and difficult in a variety of different ways. Again, these are all survival skills, if you will. They're ways that we get through those difficult experiences. And again, by paying attention to what other people need and trying to meet those needs, sometimes even before they know that they have that need, right? We're trying to prevent bad things from happening is really what a lot of it comes down to. There's a sense of, okay, this helps me feel in control because everything really feels so out of control. It's so scary. I can't really stop adults from doing things or even other kids. But we want to feel some sense of security, safety, control. And so this codependent behaviors will give us a sense of control. we're not really in control. So it's problematic because it's that false sense of control. And when we try to control other people and situations, well, first of all, I mean, it often just doesn't work because we can't actually make other people do the things that we think that they should do. And so that creates relationship problems. It causes frustration for us because we're trying to force something that quite likely other people don't want to do, or they're not interested in that solution or even interested in solving that problem. And so we end up not being able to solve the problem, but I think then creating additional problems in the relationship. And just again, like I said, the sense of frustration is immense when you are trying to control other people and situations that you in fact cannot. And then the other problem piece is that we start to feel responsible for other people and their problems. And that doesn't work because those aren't problems and situations that we can actually do anything about. We often get very confused about the difference between influence and control. If we're talking about our partner or our children, we have influence. Our control is really very limited, but we tend to overstate that and think that, okay, I can get them to do things. But generally what we're talking about is influence. And that's not the same thing. It's not nothing, but it doesn't mean that when I suggest something or want you to do something that you're going to do it.
Yeah, I think these are really, I love how you put codependence as you trying to meet the needs of other people. And people think, well, that feels like I could meet their need. And I could, if I meet their need, then they'll be happy. Then they won't be mad at me. Then they'll be pleased with me. And then there will be this tension between us. And then things will be good.
Exactly. That's exactly where it goes. And then that feels like wonderful, right? They're going to be happy. And then by extension, I'll be happy. But it's very unbalanced because it's all about the other person's needs and very little about your own needs. Again, because this is one of those things that develops within us, is this ability to suppress our needs so that we don't really even know we have a need until it's enormous sometimes. Because again, that's that survival piece from childhood is don't ask for anything, don't need anything, either because it's going to be dangerous in a sense of if you do ask for it, because people are going to be angry with you for having a need, or you're going to be constantly disappointed because people are not going to come through for you. And so you stop asking, you stop needing anything. And then it feels like, oh, problem solved. But it's not problem solved because you still have needs because you are a human being and everybody has needs. And we can't have a satisfying relationship if I am always about your needs and then there's very little coming back from the other person in terms of their interest in meeting my needs. And again, I need to take some responsibility for that because if I'm not ever saying I have a need, I can't expect people to be mind readers. But again, codependents will often find themselves in relationships with people who have a lot of needs and are often either very vocal about those needs or they're really quite obvious that they're struggling with some major issues in their lives. It's very easy for that pattern to recreate itself where here I am again, taking care of other people, and my needs just fall by the wayside. And I make excuses for that. And I say, that's okay. Their needs are more important than mine. Very familiar pattern. And there's a certain amount, I think if we're honest, there's a certain amount of that self-esteem that we garner from that we feel good at trying to help others. Because again, those are values that as a society, we think are good, and they are, right? What we're really talking, just bringing some balance back to our relationships. And this is one of the things that I talk with people a lot is that we're really just trying to reset things back to a balance point here because things are so far out of balance in our lives that it's not that we want to be selfish and have everything be about us and, oh, my needs are more important than everybody else's. No, but I need to just make sure that they're getting equal time here, right? Again, because this is both something that I need as an individual and I deserve to have my needs met, but it's also a part of having a healthy and fulfilling relationship with other adults is that there is some mutual give and take in relationships. Otherwise, we're going to constantly be unhappy in our relationships. They are not going to be fulfilling if they are so lopsided that it's all about the other person all of the time.
Okay, this just came to me as we were processing a little bit you're sharing. Would you call a codependent, and this isn't a black and white, I love gray and swim in gray, so it's not just a black and white bucketed answer, I just think for simplification, would you call it someone that is a habitual caretaker? Because we frame that as positive too. And I don't mean caretaker of caretaking someone that's ill or something along those lines. I'm talking about an emotional caretaker. That person would be classified, or we could say people pleaser. We kind of use that term a lot, as a codependent. Would that be another way to say it to somebody that's like, I'm not really a codependent, but I am a people pleaser, but I am kind of a caretaker.
Yeah.
Would you put those in the same category?
I mean, I would essentially, I tend to think of codependency as a spectrum. So that, again, this is not a you're codependent or you're not a codependent. It's to what extent.
Yes. I love spectrums.
Right. Does that fit for how big a problem is it creating for you in your life, in your relationships? And again, if we think about this on this continuum, this spectrum, we think about the way that we are socialized. And I think especially the way that girls and women are socialized. And we see a lot of overlap. Self-sacrificing, people-pleasing, caretaking, mothering. Those are on the spectrum, right? And if we're going to talk about when does that become codependent, right? It is. It's gray. And I would say, well, think about how many problems is that causing for you? How much distress is it causing for you? Are you able to do that caretaking, but also still prioritize your own needs? Are you aware that you have needs? Does it feel like there are other people in your life who are interested in meeting your needs? Things along those lines. So again, our goal is not to stop being caretakers or not be concerned about other people's emotions, because that's not a good goal. It's not likely. It's not realistic. And it also just feels like now we've missed the point of having relationships with people in the opposite.
Yeah.
Right?
Like two truths can be true. I can seek you and I can have my boundaries at the same time and say what I need. And you can say what you need and both are okay.
Yeah, I think a great segue into thinking about boundaries, because boundaries are the way that we can put some limits on this and protect ourselves from, I would say, being taken advantage of by some folks, intentionally or unintentionally, and allowing ourselves to be manipulated or used in various ways, because we can be vulnerable to that. Because again, if we don't pay attention to the old behaviors, the old ways of thinking, the things that are those default settings that a lot of us have, we will easily fall prey to people who unfortunately want to take advantage of that big heart that you have and that caretaking nature and use it all for themselves instead of people who are really interested in having that mutual relationship with you.
I find too that it's almost like when you are uncomfortable sharing your own, you're not even like, I'll ask a couple, well, what do you need? And I'm like, I don't know. It's like, and I haven't even thought about it. It's almost like if one person does share what they need, the other person, that the codependent's like, well, now I got to meet all these needs. And if I don't, they're going to leave me. It's like a fear of abandonment, a fear of them being dissatisfied, which is the other person done in a healthy way, sharing what they need. It's not a threat. They're just communicating clearly and directly with empathy. They're not being rude, but the other person feels then responsible, back to your piece on responsibility. They take it on as I've got to meet all those needs or the person's not going to be happy with me and they're going to leave. Or they set a boundary and that other person feels like they failed or brings up shame. So let's talk about boundaries and what does it mean and how do we communicate a boundary?
Boundaries serve a couple of different purposes for us. So I think most of the time we think about a boundary as a limit. So that's something that we are going to set in order to protect ourselves in some way. And this can be, again, emotional or physical, but it can also be things that boundaries that we are setting, limits that we are setting for ourselves around how we're going to use our time, our energy, our money, things like that. So I like to think of those boundaries as things, they're going to make sure that I am doing the things that are most important to me. I'm using my resources for things that matter to me rather than just sort of haphazardly saying yes to everything, doing things without consciously thinking about whether they are in line with my goals and my values. And we also want to remember that boundaries also define who we are as people. So this goes back to what we were talking about in enmeshed family systems where we don't have boundaries. There isn't the ability to have privacy. There isn't the ability to have a unique sense of self so that I can have my own ideas and values and goals that are different than my family's. If we think about as children grow up, there should be a sort of a natural process of that individuation. And that's just sort of this fancy word of saying becoming yourself, becoming your authentic self. And usually we think about teenage years as this place of experimenting, but really I think we're doing this to different extents throughout childhood experiences, is we're trying on ideas and different personality traits. We try different friends. We try different extracurricular activities. We see what we like. We're in this process of figuring out who we are. And of course, this really continues throughout our whole lives. But anyway, childhood tends to be a place where we do a lot of this because that's a developmental stage that we're going through. And then we usually think older adolescents, young adults, when we separate more and more from our parents, right? And again, that's a very active time in this. Who am I going to be? What do I want to study? What kind of work do I want to do? Who am I going to marry? Or what do I want to do with my life, essentially? And we're figuring out who we are. But if you are an enmeshed family where there's no ability to do that, you're very constricted. I mean, you're essentially going to be who your parents say you're going to be. You're going to do what they say that they want you to do. And so there's no ability to separate, right? And that's that boundary. So I can have a separation of this is me and this is you over here. And we're two separate people. And that's okay, right? We can be in relationship with each other. We can be close. We can communicate. We can trust each other, all these good relational things. But there isn't a sense of like, I have to be your clone. I don't have to be just like you. It's as if that's threatening for the parent in the enmeshed family, is they need you to be just the same. They don't know how to tolerate that you might have different ideas or want to do something that they don't understand or be something that they don't understand.
I really, really like this. Just was a beautiful way you just articulated a boundary, because we hear the word boundary all the time now. It's like, we'll set a boundary. We'll do this with boundaries. How you just set it in relation to family systems, that's really the origin of boundary. I think that's the birthplace of where boundary came from. It's okay for me to be me. It's okay for you to be you. And those two truths can coexist while I grow and evolve into who I am meant to be, my authentic self, without you feeling threatened by that. So if I go to a school further away, I'm just using this as an example, but you want me to be super close to home and that feels too scary for you, that feels too threatening. And I'm not going to pay for a school if it's not within certain miles of home because I'm too threatened by you leaving as a parent. You're not allowed to have a boundary, meaning I'm not allowed to say what works for me, what I want. That's a beautiful articulation I've not heard from anybody when we talk about boundaries. Of really, that's the birthplace of a boundary. Therefore, why do we struggle with boundaries? It makes sense.
Right, because if you can't be a separate, unique, independent person, then you can't set boundaries.
Without mom or dad being upset with you.
Yeah, or without you feeling guilty about it.
Yes.
It's like you're doing something wrong because it feels, yes, I'm threatening this relationship. I'm saying you can't be all up in my business or telling me what to do, and I can't make my own decisions even though I'm 50 years old, right? So that's where we get into those problem pieces with it, is that we aren't really feeling like we are separate people. And it's hard to separate from your parents if your parents won't let go.
It is, because you feel guilty. That is, I hear so many clients say, well, I'm so guilty. Well, say how you feel. And they get real big-eyed, like, no, never tell my parent that. Are you kidding me? No way. And they're like, I would feel the guilt and the fear takes over, and almost like they go to their defensive shutdown. Like, I'm just going to avoid any kind of those conversations because it's not worth it. They're going to get too upset, too dysregulated. So I'll pretend, I'll go along, I'll placate, I'll say what they want to hear.
I have sadly known quite a number of people who have not felt like they could really live their lives while their parents were still alive.
Yes.
And that, like I said, that's very sad. And I think there are probably a subset of parents who would say, I don't want you, to do anything that I don't agree with. And there are other parents who I think really don't realize that they are holding their kids, their adult children, back so much that there's just a lack of awareness on their part that their child is suffering to this extent, in part because their kids have never said. It's just been the way it has always been.
So when we
Yeah.
work on our own
tough.
self, it is tough. As a parent, if we work on our own self, then we can tolerate the discomfort of them individuating and separating, like being their authentic self. So if they say they want to go to whatever school that's far away, you can soothe that part of you that's scared and fearful. If we don't do that work, we fall into perpetuating. Would you call that codependent parent?
Yes. I think we're sort of getting into the nitty gritty of what's the difference between codependent parenting and having an enmeshed relationship with your adult child. I think for our purposes, it's fine to use them interchangeably. There's technically a slight difference, but by and large, we're really talking about the same thing. Yes, where there's that over-reliance on another person for emotional needs, that sense of needing to take care of them, right? So we've got a mismatch in the relationship. And of course, parent-child relationships are not the same as romantic relationships in terms of our expectations, but as children grow up, the relationship between the parent and the child tends to, or it should, become more equal over time, right? When our children are young, I mean, it's very different in terms of expectations and power and the roles that we're playing. But as adults, we shouldn't feel like we are, I don't think, emotionally responsible for our parents.
I think what happens too, and I know we're almost out of time, is we recreate a parent-child relationship romantically. I see it a lot in my office. It's like, okay, one person feels like you're parenting me and one person feels like, well, you're acting more like the child. And I think that dysfunctional families, it can transcend into that in romantic relationships where it can play out as a parent-child dynamic or child-child dynamic. So,
but I think you're right. Often that codependent relationship feels like the person that we tend to call the codependent in the relationship is the one who's trying to parent, right? The problems, fix it, make sure people are okay, take care of everybody's needs. And again, even the partner or the other person who's having a lot of struggles, even if they are aware that they're having a lot of problems in their life, nobody appreciates being treated like a child when they're an adult.
It usually doesn't work because they've been there and done that.
It doesn't feel good. I mean, it often feels very condescending, to have somebody telling you what to do or offering you advice when you're not looking for that.
I think that is so true. The condescending, because you're like, do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I'm an idiot? Is kind of what people will say.
Right. I mean, I think, codependents by and large have very good intentions in trying to take care of people and trying to make sure that they don't end up in worse situations. But I think it's an offshoot of that wanting to feel in control is there becomes a sense of like, I know better than you do what you need. And that's the part that starts to feel condescending because you don't. You think you do, but you don't, because how can you know what somebody needs more than they do? I don't think it's possible.
I agree. I think that's a really good point. What are the top 3 recommendations you have for someone wanting to set a boundary? Like, where do they start?
Just understand what it is that you need. What are you trying to accomplish with the boundary? So a boundary should be rooted in a need. I need something. That's where I start with the boundary. And then you want to figure out, what are my options? How can I get this need met? Sometimes the need is going to be something that I can meet myself. It's an action that I can make. It's a change that I can make on my own. Or do I need to ask somebody else to change their behavior? And this is where we will skip over that possibility that it's something we can do on our own and think, oh, I got to ask somebody else to do something. And that's not necessarily wrong. I mean, sometimes we do, or sometimes it's a viable option. But again, we need to remember that sometimes people are not going to be willing to make those changes. And that doesn't mean we have no options, right? We want to remember that some situations we can make a change. They just tend to not be the changes that we want to make. Because let's be honest, I would prefer you to do the changing. It's not easier. I'd prefer you to change than for me to have to change. So sometimes it feels like it's not my top choice, but it is still a good way to get that need met. And I've lost track on it, how many steps I'm on now. But anyway, we want to evaluate, is it working? And then we're going to keep adjusting. We want to remember that setting boundaries is not a one and done situation in most scenarios. So sometimes we need to keep setting the same boundary if we feel like this is a good approach. Or if it's not working, we want to come back and say, okay, what are the other options? Is there a different way for me to communicate this? What is it that's not working here? Do that troubleshooting piece so that we can try to fine tune the boundary until it's working better for us.
I love your first step. Figure out your need. That is essential. I think that's your roadmap. That's your navigational system. If you really don't know what need you're trying to get met, whether for yourself, it doesn't mean the other person's going to meet that need. It's for yourself.
Exactly.
I think that's a beautiful way to articulate a boundary.
Yeah. I need to feel respected in this relationship. I need to save my money. I need more sleep. What is it that I need? And we often skip over this. And I'll tell you, the other thing is by focusing on understanding what your need is, you're also going to avoid doing things, confusing boundaries with ultimatums or punishing other people. Because it's unlikely that you're going to say, my need is for you to suffer. That's not my need, right? My need is to be understood, or my need is to feel respected. I can frame it in a way that is actually based on what my need is. And therefore, I'm sure that the boundary I'm setting is for me, and it's not for somebody else's detriment, I guess I would say.
Would you say be clear and specific about the need?
Yeah. I mean, you want to be clear with yourself. I mean, the clearer that you can be, I think the better the boundary will be. But also we want to be clear and specific if we're going to be communicating the boundary to other people. Absolutely. Again, we could probably have a long conversation about that and just getting into communication, because it's tough, especially if you really didn't learn a lot of communication skills or see people communicate in healthy ways. And I think it's just universal that we tend to think that we're being clearer than we are because we understand what we're saying and why we're saying it. But we have to really explain things in a lot more detail for other people to understand them.
Yes, we might have to have a part 2 on communication around boundaries. Where can people find your books, your resources?
Yeah.
This is the perfect segue.
So the books, the Better Boundary Workbook and the CBT Workbook for Perfectionism, should be available from most bookstores. So those are on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, wherever you tend to buy your books. Support your local bookshop. Hopefully they have it there. And then on my website, livewellwithsharonmartin.com is where people can find all the rest of my articles.
It's been so delightful to talk to you. I feel like we could go on for hours, because you have so much wealth and wisdom of information, and your heart, you can just feel it coming across when you're sharing your passion in helping others. So thank you so much for being here today with us. I was so grateful.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. And yes, I agree. There's much to be said. They're complicated issues. So yeah, for everybody who's listening, take it slow, I would say. It's a lot to digest depending on where you are in that journey. But hopefully that has been supportive for people. And thank you again, Kristen. It's been great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. You might want to listen to this podcast a couple of times because there was so much depth of wisdom. So feel free to listen to it again. If you're like, there was different pieces and nuggets. I just sometimes listen to things twice because it sinks in deeper. And then a third time, you're really grasping the concepts more. So I always say, if this felt like a lot, you resonated on many points, just listen to it again if you need that support. And sometimes when you're really starting this journey, it's helpful to have encouragement along the way and let this serve as some encouragement that you're on the right path to self-discovery and self-empowerment. So thank you for being here and listening. And I'm so grateful for you, Sharon, and your work. Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week, and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, D, Boyce, BOICE.com. Thanks and have a great day.